Section 12. Finney's warning about scrupulosity, avoiding false guilt *. Charles Finney was very aware that some sincere Christians falsely accuse themselves of sin when they are actually resisting temptation. He warned that confusing temptation with consent can lead to unnecessary guilt, discouragement, and spiritual instability. Here is how Finney would help someone discern this clearly and avoid scrupulosity. Temptation itself is not proof of sin. Finney repeatedly emphasized that temptation belongs to the sensibility, not the will. He taught that many people mistakenly believe, "If I feel it strongly, I must have consented." But this is false in his theology. The strength of a feeling does not prove consent. The only thing that proves sin is the will's choice to embrace it. He would say, temptation proves you are being tempted, not that you have sinned. The presence of unwanted thoughts or feelings often proves the will is opposing them. Finney would point out something very important. If you are disturbed by a thought, resisting it, and rejecting it, this itself is evidence that your will is not consenting. The distress itself shows opposition. If the will had truly embraced it, there would be inward agreement, not resistance. Resistance is evidence of obedience, not sin. Scrupulous people often mistake involuntary thoughts for voluntary intention. Finney taught that thoughts can enter the mind involuntarily. These may come through memory, association, external stimuli, emotional triggers. The will did not create them. The will only decides what to do with them. Scrupulosity falsely treats involuntary thoughts as voluntary choices. Finney rejected this completely. The key question is not, did the thought occur, but did the will embrace it? Finney would direct a person away from analyzing feelings and toward examining intention. He would ask, did you choose it? Did you want it? Did you embrace it? Or did you reject it? If the will rejected it, there is no sin, even if the thought was vivid or persistent. Finney warned that excessive self-accusation can weaken spiritual stability. Constantly accusing oneself without cause can produce confusion, discouragement, emotional instability, loss of confidence in obedience. Finney believed this distracts from actual obedience. He taught that peace comes from recognizing the true state of the will, not from achieving emotional perfection. The will can remain fully obedient while the sensibility is in conflict. Finney emphasized that emotional conflict does not equal moral conflict. A person may feel strong opposing desires while the will remains fully set on God. This is not hypocrisy. This is the normal condition of moral testing. The will determines character, not emotional calmness. Finney would say false guilt often comes from misunderstanding the nature of moral responsibility. Finney believed people are only responsible for what they choose, not for what they feel involuntarily, not for what appears in the mind involuntarily, only for what the will consents to. This was central to his theology. One of Finney's clearest practical tests. If you could honestly choose to remove the temptation instantly, would you? If the answer is yes, your will is not consenting. Your will is opposed to it. This proves obedience. Consent involves willingness. Resistance involves unwillingness. He taught that the governing intention defines the heart, not passing mental states. Finney believed the heart is defined by its supreme intention, not by momentary thoughts, not by emotional fluctuations. If your governing intention is to please God, that defines your character, even if opposing feelings arise. Finney would say that wrongly accusing yourself of consent when you are resisting is itself a mistake of judgment, not proof of sin. The error is intellectual misunderstanding, not moral rebellion. The solution is clarity, not repentance for something you did not choose. Final summary in Finney's framework. Finney taught that many sincere believers falsely accuse themselves of sin when they are actually resisting temptation. He He emphasized that involuntary thoughts, desires, and feelings are not sin unless the will consents to them. The true test is whether the will embraces or rejects the temptation. If the will rejects it and remains set on pleasing God, there is obedience, even if the temptation is strong, persistent, or emotionally disturbing. Finney's direct quotes and core principles on the will versus sensibility asterisk. Section 1. Moral character belongs only to the will, not the sensibility asterisk. From Lectures on Systematic Theology. Moral character belongs solely to the ultimate intention of the will. The sensibility has no moral character. This is Finney's foundation. Meaning, feelings themselves are not morally good or evil. Only the will's governing intention determines moral character. Even strong feelings do not define sin or holiness. Only intention does. Section 2. The sensibility acts involuntarily and is not itself sinful asterisk asterisk. From Systematic Theology. The states of the sensibility are involuntary and therefore can have no moral character in themselves. This is extremely clear. Involuntary means not chosen. And Finney says directly, they cannot be sinful in themselves, because sin requires choice. Section 3. Desire itself is not sin asterisk. From Systematic Theology. Desire is not itself sin. It is only when the will yields to desire and chooses gratification that sin exists. This is one of his clearest definitions. Desire equals not sin. Yielding to desire equals sin. The will's consent is the dividing line. Section 4. Sin consists in the will's choice of self-gratification asterisk. From Systematic Theology. All sin consists in selfishness, or in the will's choosing self-gratification as the supreme end. Sin is not feeling selfish impulses, feeling pride, feeling attraction. Sin is choosing self-gratification. The will defines sin. Section 5. The sensibility cannot be directly controlled by the will asterisk asterisk. From Systematic Theology. The sensibility is not directly under the control of the will. This explains why temptation can arise even when the will is obedient. Feelings arise automatically. The will cannot prevent their initial appearance. The will only decides whether to consent. Section 6. Temptation is not sin asterisk. From his sermon Moral Depravity. Temptation is not itself sin. It is only the yielding of the will that constitutes sin. This is explicit. Temptation itself is morally neutral. Sin begins only at yielding, not before. Section 7. The will is always free to resist desire. From Systematic Theology. The will is not necessitated by the sensibility. Meaning, feelings do not force the will. No matter how strong the feeling, the will remains free. Therefore temptation itself cannot be sin, because sin requires voluntary choice. Section 8. Holiness consists in right intention, not absence of contrary feelings. From Systematic Theology. Holiness consists in the supreme, ultimate intention of the will. He does not define holiness as absence of temptation. He defines holiness as right intention, even if contrary feelings exist. Section 9. The sensibility follows the will gradually, not instantly asterisk. From Systematic Theology. The feelings will come to correspond with the action of the will. This explains why temptation may persist for a time, but weakens as obedience continues. The will leads. The sensibility follows. Section 10. There can be no sin without voluntary transgression asterisk. From Systematic Theology. There can be no sin without a voluntary transgression of known law. This completely rules out involuntary feelings as sin. Sin requires voluntary choice. Without voluntary choice, there is no sin. Finney's clearest summary statement, combining his teachings. In Finney's framework, feelings arise involuntarily. Desire itself is not sin. Temptation itself is not sin. Sin occurs only when the will consents. Moral character belongs only to the will's governing intention. Section 11, where to verify these teachings directly. These are public domain and freely available. Systematic Theology, full text, https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/37698. Lectures to Professing Christians, https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/37745. Sermons on Important Subjects, https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/37730. The Oberlin Evangelist Sermons Archive, https://www.truthinheart.com/Oberlin-Evangelist/. Final summary in Finney's own theological terms, ****. Finney taught that temptation, desire, and emotional impulses arise involuntarily in the sensibility and are not themselves sin. Sin exists only when the will voluntarily consents to self-gratification instead of choosing God as the supreme end. Therefore, a person whose will remains set on pleasing God is obedient, even if contrary feelings and temptations arise. Section 12, Finney's detailed explanation of intellect, sensibility, and will ****. Charles Finney explains the difference between the intellect, sensibility, and will most clearly in his lectures on systematic theology, especially in the section titled Moral Agency. This is the foundation of his entire understanding of temptation, sin, and obedience. Here is Finney's structure explained with his own definitions and direct quotes. The intellect perceives and presents information. Finney defined the intellect as the faculty that perceives truth, forms ideas, reasons, judges, presents options to the will. He wrote, "The intellect is the faculty that thinks, reasons, judges, and forms ideas. The intellect does not choose. It only presents knowledge. For example, the intellect recognizes this action would please God. This action would please self. It presents both options, but it does not decide between them. The sensibility produces feelings and desires automatically." Finney defined the sensibility as the faculty of feeling. He wrote, "The sensibility is the faculty of feeling. All pleasure and pain belong to it. This includes desires, emotions, attractions, aversions, impulses, emotional reactions." Most importantly, Finney emphasized, the states of the sensibility are involuntary. This means you do not directly choose your feelings. They arise automatically in response to what the intellect perceives. For example, if the intellect perceives praise right arrow, the sensibility may produce pleasure. If the intellect perceives danger right arrow, the sensibility produces fear. These occur automatically, not by moral choice. The will, the only faculty that makes moral choices. Finney defined the will as the governing faculty. He wrote, "The will is the executive faculty. It chooses or refuses choice. And most importantly, the will alone is the faculty of moral agency. This means only the will can sin. Only the will can obey God. Only the will determines moral character. Not the intellect. Not the sensibility. Only the will. The will chooses the supreme end of life." This is Finney's most important concept. He taught that the will sets the supreme intention. He wrote, "The ultimate intention of the will determines moral character. The will chooses between God as the supreme end, or self as the supreme end. This governing choice defines the heart, not passing feelings. The sensibility does not control the will." Finney explicitly rejected the idea that feelings control choice. He wrote, "The will is not necessitated by the sensibility. This means feelings influence, but do not force. The will remains free, even under strong emotional pressure. The sensibility responds automatically to what the intellect presents. Finney explained the sequence like this. Step 1, the intellect perceives something. Step 2, the sensibility produces feelings automatically. Step 3, the will chooses how to respond. For example, you say praise, intellect perceives. You feel pleasure or pride, impulse, sensibility reacts. Then the will chooses. Embrace pride, sin. Or reject pride, obedience. The feeling itself was not sin. The choice determines sin. The will indirectly influences the sensibility over time. Finney taught that while the will cannot instantly control feelings, it influences them indirectly. He wrote, "The will can direct the attention, and thus indirectly influence the sensibility. By choosing what to focus on, the will reshapes emotional patterns. Over time, the sensibility aligns with the will. This explains spiritual growth. The sensibility may conflict with the will without moral guilt. This is extremely important in Finney's theology. He taught that opposing feelings do not mean opposing intention. The will may fully choose God, while the sensibility produces contrary desires. This is temptation, not sin. Sin occurs only if the will consents." Finney's complete structure, summarized in his own framework. Intellect knows, perceives, presents options. Sensibility feels, desires, reacts automatically. Will chooses, governs, determines moral character. Only the will sins. Only the will obeys. Finney's clearest summary quote. From Systematic Theology. The intellect perceives, the sensibility feels, and the will chooses. This single sentence summarizes his entire psychology. Simple real-life example using Finney's framework. You are insulted. Intellect recognizes the insult. Sensibility produces anger automatically. Will chooses either revenge, sin, or forgiveness, obedience. The anger feeling itself was not sin. The will's choice determines sin. Where you can read this directly in Finney's own writing. Public domain full text. Systematic Theology, see Moral Agency section. https://www.org/files/37698/37698h/37698h htm. Specifically look for the intellect, the sensibility, the will. These sections explain everything above in detail. Final summary in Finney's exact framework. According to Finney, the intellect perceives truth, the sensibility produces feelings involuntarily, and the will alone makes moral choices. Temptation arises in the sensibility automatically, but sin occurs only when the will consents to self-gratification, instead of choosing God as the supreme end. The governing intention of the will, not involuntary feelings, determines the true state of the heart. Section 13. Why a fully consecrated will can still experience unwanted desires without hypocrisy. Charles Finney directly addressed this concern, how a person can be fully consecrated in their will, and yet still experience unwanted desires, impulses, or feelings, without being a hypocrite. His answer rests entirely on the distinction between the ultimate intention of the will and the involuntary states of the sensibility. Here is Finney's explanation in his own theological framework, with his actual ideas and supporting quotes. Consecration belongs to the will, not the sensibility. Finney taught that true consecration is an act of the will setting God as its supreme end. He wrote in Systematic Theology, "Holiness consists in the supreme, ultimate intention of the will." Notice what he does not say. He does not say holiness consists in having no contrary feelings. He says holiness consists in the will's governing intention. This means a person can be fully consecrated in their will even while their sensibility produces contrary feelings. The sensibility continues to produce involuntary feelings even after full consecration. Finney explicitly taught, the sensibility is involuntary and its states are not under the direct control of the will. This means, even after the will fully chooses God, the sensibility may still produce emotional impulses, sudden desires, attractions, feelings of pride, feelings of fear. These do not originate in the will. They arise automatically. They do not contradict consecration unless the will consents to them. Hypocrisy exists only when the will secretly chooses self, not when feelings conflict with the will. Finney defined hypocrisy as a divided ultimate intention. Hypocrisy is when the will claims to choose God outwardly, but inwardly chooses self. But this is very different from involuntary feelings. If the will truly chooses God and rejects selfish desires, there is no hypocrisy, even if those desires appear in the sensibility. Hypocrisy is a choice of the will, not a condition of the sensibility. Finney taught that temptation itself can exist alongside full obedience. He wrote clearly, "Temptation is not sin. It is only when the will yields to temptation that sin exists." This means temptation and obedience can exist at the same time. Temptation occurs in the sensibility. Obedience occurs in the will. If the will refuses consent, obedience remains intact. Christ himself experienced temptation while remaining perfectly consecrated. Finney used Christ as the ultimate example. Christ experienced hunger, distress, emotional suffering, temptation, yet remained perfectly holy. Why? Because his will never consented to self-gratification. This proves temptation does not contradict consecration. The will and sensibility can temporarily be in conflict without moral contradiction. Finney explained that the sensibility reflects natural laws, past conditioning, and external stimuli. It does not instantly conform to the will, but over time it gradually aligns. This temporary conflict is not hypocrisy. It is part of the normal structure of moral agency. The will determines moral character, not the sensibility. The true test of consecration is what the will does with temptation. Finney would ask, when temptation appears, what does the will do? Does it embrace it or reject it? If it rejects it, consecration is genuine, even if the temptation feels strong. The strength of temptation does not determine consecration. The will's response does. Finney taught that emotional harmony develops gradually after consecration. He explained that the sensibility gradually comes into harmony with the will. He wrote, "The feelings will come to correspond with the state of the will. This happens progressively, not instantly. Consecration is immediate. Emotional harmony follows gradually." Finney's clearest summary principle: consecration is a voluntary choice of the will to make God the supreme end of life. Tempting feelings that arise involuntarily do not contradict consecration unless the will consents to them. Finney's simplest illustration, based on his principles: a loyal person may feel fear but still choose courage. The fear does not make them disloyal. Only choosing betrayal would. Likewise, unwanted desires do not make a person unconsecrated. Only consenting to them would. Final summary in Finney's exact framework. According to Finney, a person can be fully consecrated in their will and still experience unwanted desires, because those desires arise in the sensibility, which operates involuntarily. Consecration belongs to the ultimate intention of the will, not to the involuntary states of feeling. Therefore, temptation does not make a person a hypocrite unless the will consents to it. The true state of the heart is determined by the governing choice of the will, not by the presence or strength of involuntary desires. Section 14. How to know with certainty whether your ultimate intention is truly set on God *. Charles Finney gave very concrete, objective tests to determine whether your ultimate intention is truly set on God, as opposed to merely having religious feelings, desires, or impressions. His tests focus entirely on the actual governing choice of the will, not emotions. Here are Finney's own diagnostic principles, drawn from systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and the Oberlin Evangelist. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you choose when self and God conflict. This was Finney's primary test. He taught that your true supreme end is shown when obedience costs you something. He wrote, "The true intention of the mind is shown by what it chooses when duty and self-interest come into competition." Ask, when obedience to God conflicts with self-gratification, what do you choose? If you choose obedience, your will is set on God. Not because you feel like it, but because you choose it. The choice reveals the governing intention. Your ultimate intention is revealed by your honest willingness to obey all known duty. Finney emphasized willingness, not perfection of performance. He taught, if your will is truly consecrated to God, you are willing to obey everything He shows you. Not selectively, not partially, but universally. He wrote, if the will is right, there is a universal willingness to obey God. This willingness is the evidence of true consecration. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you inwardly prefer most. Finney taught that the supreme end is what you ultimately prefer above all else. Not emotionally, but voluntarily. Ask, if forced to choose between pleasing God or pleasing yourself, which would you choose? Your honest answer reveals your governing intention. Even if self still feels attractive emotionally, the will's preference defines the heart. Your ultimate intention is revealed by whether you resist or indulge temptation. Finney taught this clearly. When temptation arises, the will must take a side. If the will resists temptation because it chooses God, this proves consecration. If the will embraces temptation, this reveals selfish intention. Resistance is evidence of obedience, even if the temptation feels strong. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you would choose if there were no consequences. This was one of Finney's most penetrating tests. Remove fear of punishment, fear of consequences, fear of being seen. What would you honestly choose? Your answer reveals your true supreme end. Consecration means choosing God for His own sake, not merely to avoid consequences. Your ultimate intention is revealed by your present governing choice, not past failures or present feelings. Finney strongly emphasized this. Your present intention defines your present character. Not your past. Not your emotional state. Not your history of temptation. He taught, the question is not, what have you felt? But what are you choosing now? If your will is presently set on God, that is your true character. Your ultimate intention is revealed by whether you justify sin or oppose it. Finney taught that when the will is set on God, it does not defend sin. It opposes sin. Even when tempted. Even when weak emotionally. The will remains aligned with God's law. Not because of feelings, but because of choice. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you truly want to be true about yourself. Finney believed this question exposes the will's deepest intention. Do you want to be fully obedient to God? Or do you want permission to serve self? Your honest answer reveals your governing intention. Even if you still struggle emotionally. Finney's clearest summary statement. From systematic theology. The supreme intention, or choice of the highest end, is the whole of moral character. This means, your governing intention defines your character. Not your feelings. Not your temptations. Not your emotional state. Your choice defines your heart. The simplest test Finney would give. He would ask, right now, do you choose God as your supreme end? Not emotionally, but voluntarily. If yes, then your will is consecrated, even if contrary feelings exist. Final summary in Finney's own theological framework. According to Finney, you can know your ultimate intention is set on God if your will chooses obedience over self-gratification, is willing to obey all known duty, resists temptation rather than embracing it, and prefers God above self when honestly examined. The governing choice of the will, not involuntary feelings or emotional fluctuations, determines the true state of the heart. Why a person may still feel emotionally drawn towards sin, even while their will is fully set against it. Section 1. The sensibility operates involuntarily according to fixed laws. Charles Finney taught very clearly that a person may still feel emotionally drawn towards sin, even when their will is fully set against it. He explained this as a normal consequence of how the sensibility operates according to natural laws, which do not instantly change when the will changes its supreme intention. Here is Finney's explanation in his own theological framework, with direct principles from systematic theology and his sermons. Finney wrote in Systematic Theology, "The sensibility is involuntary, and its states are produced by causes over which the will has no direct control. This means feelings arise automatically in response to memories, associations, bodily conditions, external stimuli, past habits, even when the will has fully chosen obedience. The will cannot instantly shut off emotional responses. It can only choose whether to consent." Section 2. Past indulgence leaves lasting emotional tendencies. Finney taught that when desires have been indulged in the past, the sensibility becomes conditioned. This conditioning does not disappear instantly when the will repents. The will can change immediately, but the sensibility adjusts gradually. He explained that this is because emotional responses follow laws of association and habit. The old emotional patterns weaken over time as the will consistently refuses indulgence. Section 3. The intellect continues to perceive objects that naturally produce feelings. Finney taught that when the intellect perceives something desirable, the sensibility naturally responds. This is automatic. For example, if the intellect perceives something previously associated with pleasure, the sensibility produces desire. This occurs even when the will rejects it. The perception triggers the emotional response, not the will. Section 4. The sensibility was designed to respond to perceived good or evil. Finney taught that the sensibility itself is not sinful. It was created to respond to perceived value. It produces attraction toward what appears pleasurable, and aversion toward what appears painful. These reactions occur automatically. Sin exists only if the will chooses self-gratification, not when the sensibility produces desire. Section 5. The will and sensibility are distinct faculties that do not change simultaneously. Finney emphasized that conversion is a change in the will's governing intention, not an instant elimination of all contrary feelings. He wrote, "Holiness consists in the supreme intention of the will." He did not say holiness consists in having no contrary emotional impulses. The will changes immediately. The sensibility follows progressively. Section 6. Temptation requires the presence of alternative desires. Finney taught that moral freedom requires alternatives. If the sensibility could never produce desires contrary to obedience, temptation would not exist, and moral choice would not be meaningful. Temptation presents options. The will chooses between them. The existence of temptation does not contradict obedience. It makes obedience meaningful. Section 7. The sensibility gradually comes into harmony with the will through repeated obedience. Finney wrote, "The feelings will come to correspond with the action of the will. This is progressive, not instantaneous. As the will consistently refuses sinful indulgence, the sensibility gradually changes. Desires weaken. New emotional patterns develop. But this process takes time." Section 8. Christ himself experienced emotional distress and temptation while remaining perfectly obedient. Finney pointed to Christ as the clearest example. Christ experienced intense hunger, emotional agony, distress, yet his will remained perfectly consecrated. This proves emotional experience does not contradict consecration. The will determines moral character, not emotional state. Section 9. Emotional attraction does not equal voluntary intention. Finney made this distinction very clearly. Feeling drawn towards something is not the same as choosing it. Choice belongs to the will. Attraction belongs to the sensibility. The will may fully reject what the sensibility feels. This is temptation, not sin. Section 10. Finney's clearest summary principle asterisk. A person may feel emotional attraction towards sin because the sensibility continues to operate according to natural laws and past conditioning, even after the will has fully consecrated itself to God. These involuntary feelings are not sin unless the will consents to them. Finney's simplest real-life illustration. A person may feel fear when doing their duty. The fear does not mean they have chosen cowardice. If their will chooses duty, they remain faithful. The feeling does not define their character. The choice does. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework asterisk. According to Finney, emotional attraction towards sin can continue even when the will is fully set against sin, because feelings arise involuntarily in the sensibility due to natural laws, past associations, and external stimuli. Conversion changes the governing intention of the will immediately, but the sensibility gradually comes into harmony with that intention. Therefore, unwanted desires do not indicate a sinful heart unless the will consents to them. Section 11. How to weaken these desires in the fastest and most effective way according to Finney. Charles Finney taught that unwanted desires weaken most effectively not by trying to directly suppress feelings, but by governing the will, attention, and habits in accordance with truth. He believed the sensibility changes fastest when the will consistently refuses indulgence and actively strengthens opposite patterns. Here is Finney's practical method, drawn directly from his systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and Oberlin evangelist sermons. Firmly and decisively refuse consent every time. This was Finney's most important principle. He taught that the will must take a clear, decisive stand against temptation. Not negotiate, not linger, not debate with it, but reject it. He wrote, "If the will refuses consent, sin does not exist. Temptation may remain, but it has no moral character. Every refusal weakens the desire's influence. Every consent strengthens it. The will is the control point. Immediately withdraw attention from the temptation." Finney taught that attention is the fuel that strengthens desire. He wrote that the will controls attention, and attention strengthens whatever it rests on. If attention remains on the temptation, the emotional intensity grows. If attention is withdrawn, the emotional intensity weakens. This is a fixed psychological law in his system. He emphasized redirecting the mind deliberately, not passively waiting for feelings to change. Positively fix the mind on God, truth, and right action. Finney taught that the mind cannot remain in a neutral vacuum. Attention must move towards something else. He wrote that spiritual strength increases by actively fixing the mind on truth. Not merely resisting error, but actively embracing truth. This strengthens the governing intention and reshapes emotional patterns. Refuse all outward and inward indulgence. Finney taught that indulgence includes not only actions, but inward mental indulgence. He warned that mental indulgence strengthens desire just as much as outward indulgence. He emphasized complete refusal, not partial refusal, not outward restraint with inward indulgence, but full inward and outward rejection. This stops reinforcement of the emotional pattern. Establish new habits of obedience immediately. Finney taught that habit is one of the strongest forces shaping the sensibility. He wrote that repeated obedience establishes new patterns. The sensibility gradually conforms to these patterns. This happens through consistent repetition, not occasional effort. Consistency is critical. Avoid situations that unnecessarily trigger temptation while strengthening new patterns. Finney believed wisdom includes avoiding unnecessary exposure to temptation while the sensibility is still adjusting. This is not weakness. It is intelligent cooperation with psychological law. He taught that reducing triggers accelerates emotional realignment. Strengthen the opposite affection. Finney taught that love for God weakens love for self-gratification. The stronger the governing intention becomes, the weaker contrary desires become. He emphasized cultivating genuine love for God as the supreme end. Not merely suppressing desire, but replacing it. Maintain a steady, settled governing intention. Finney emphasized stability, not constant redeciding, but maintaining a firm, settled intention. When the will remains steady, the sensibility gradually stabilizes around it. Instability slows progress. Consistency accelerates it. Understand that weakening occurs through fixed laws, not emotional force. Finney emphasized that feelings weaken through disuse, not through emotional struggle, not through force, but through consistent non-indulgence. This is gradual but reliable. He taught that this process is governed by natural laws established by God. Finney's clearest summary principle. He wrote in substance throughout his theology. When the will steadily refuses to gratify desire and fixes itself on God as the supreme end, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony and the desires lose their power. This is inevitable if obedience remains consistent. Simple analogy Finney would agree with. A path in a field becomes worn by repeated walking. If walking stops, grass gradually grows over it. If a new path is used, it becomes the stronger path. Desire follows the same law. Indulgence strengthens. Refusal weakens. Final summary in Finney's exact framework. According to Finney, unwanted desires weaken most effectively when the will consistently refuses consent, withdraws attention from temptation, fixes the mind on truth, establishes habits of obedience, and strengthens love for God as the supreme end. The sensibility gradually conforms to the governing intention of the will through fixed psychological and spiritual laws, causing desires to weaken through disuse and replacement. Section 12. Why trying to fight feelings directly often makes them stronger instead of weaker. Charles Finney explicitly taught that trying to fight feelings directly often makes them stronger, because feelings do not yield to direct force of the will. Instead, they are governed by attention, intention, and natural mental laws. His solution was not to attack feelings themselves, but to govern the will and attention, which indirectly reshapes the sensibility. Here is Finney's explanation in his own framework, with his actual principles and supporting quotes. Feelings cannot be changed by direct force of the will. Finney wrote in Systematic Theology. The sensibility is not under the direct control of the will. This means you cannot simply command yourself, stop feeling this, and make it instantly disappear. Feelings arise automatically in response to what the mind perceives and attends to. Trying to directly suppress a feeling is ineffective because the will does not directly produce feelings. It only governs choice and attention. Directly fighting a feeling keeps attention fixed on it, which strengthens it. Finney taught that attention is what sustains emotional intensity. When you try to fight a feeling directly, your attention remains fixed on it. Attention reinforces emotional states. This is a law of mind. The more attention you give to a feeling, the stronger and more persistent it becomes. Even negative attention strengthens it. The will controls attention, and attention controls emotional intensity. Finney wrote, the will can direct the attention, and thus indirectly control the sensibility. This is the key. The will does not control feelings directly, but it controls what the mind dwells on. When attention is redirected, emotional intensity weakens naturally. Without attention, feelings lose their sustaining force. Attempting to suppress feelings directly creates internal fixation. Finney understood that suppression often leads to increased mental fixation. The person keeps checking whether the feeling is gone, This repeated checking keeps attention on the feeling, which sustains it. This prolongs the emotional state, not because the will is weak, but because attention remains engaged. The correct method is to refuse consent and redirect attention. Finney taught that the proper response to temptation is simple and decisive. Refuse consent. Turn attention away. Fix the mind on truth and duty. Not struggle emotionally. Not analyze the feeling repeatedly, but calmly refuse and redirect. This removes reinforcement. Emotional states weaken naturally when they are not reinforced. Finney believed this was a fixed psychological law established by God. Feelings persist when reinforced. Feelings weaken when neglected. When the will refuses indulgence and attention shifts elsewhere, the emotional state gradually loses strength. This happens naturally, without direct emotional struggle. Christ demonstrated this principle in temptation. Finney pointed to Christ resisting Satan by calmly standing on truth. Christ did not emotionally wrestle with the temptation. He simply rejected it and stood firm in truth. The will remained steady. Attention remained fixed on obedience. The temptation lost its force. Finney warned against confusing emotional struggle with moral victory. Finney taught that moral victory occurs in the will, not in emotional intensity. A person may feel strong temptation while remaining fully obedient. Victory is determined by the will's refusal, not by emotional calmness. Waiting for emotional calmness before believing obedience exists is a mistake. Obedience exists when the will refuses consent. The fastest way to weaken a feeling is to starve it of attention and reinforcement. Finney taught that emotional patterns weaken most quickly when they are neither indulged nor fixated on. This allows the sensibility to gradually realign with the will. Attention shifts. Reinforcement stops. Emotional intensity fades. This is gradual but reliable. Finney's clearest summary principle. In substance, throughout his theology, Finney taught: feelings cannot be controlled directly by force of will, but they are indirectly governed by attention and intention. When the will refuses consent and withdraws attention from temptation, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony, and the feeling loses its power. Simple analogy Finney would agree with. Imagine a fire. Trying to fight the fire directly with your hands only keeps you close to it. Removing the fuel causes it to die naturally. Attention is the fuel. Remove attention and the fire weakens. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework. According to Finney, trying to fight feelings directly often strengthens them because the sensibility is not under direct control of the will, and emotional intensity is sustained by attention. The proper method is not to suppress feelings directly, but to refuse consent in the will and redirect attention toward truth and obedience. As attention and reinforcement are withdrawn, the sensibility gradually conforms to the governing intention of the will, and the unwanted feelings weaken naturally. Section 13. Finney's precise definition of what consent of the will actually feels like internally. Charles Finney defined consent of the will very precisely. He taught that it is not a feeling, not a sensation, and not the presence of desire, but a voluntary inward decision to embrace self-gratification as an end. Understanding this distinction is critical, because many people confuse temptation, felt in the sensibility, with consent, chosen in the will. Here is Finney's explanation in clear, exact terms based on his systematic theology and sermons. Consent of the will is an inward choice, not a feeling. Finney taught that the will does not feel, it chooses. He wrote, "The will is the faculty of choice. It chooses the end to be secured." Consent is when the will says, in substance, "I will have this," not necessarily in words, but in intention. It is a voluntary embracing, not merely experiencing a desire. A desire may exist without consent. Consent is choosing the desire's fulfillment as an end. Consent involves inward agreement with the desire. Consent means the will stops opposing the temptation and begins agreeing with it. This agreement may be quiet and internal, not dramatic, not emotional, but real. It is when the will sides with the temptation instead of opposing it. Finney defined sin as the will's consenting to self-gratification. Consent is the decisive point where temptation becomes sin. Consent feels like willingness, not mere attraction. This is one of the clearest ways to recognize it. Temptation feels like I am being pulled. Consent feels like I am willing. Temptation presents. Consent embraces. Temptation is involuntary. Consent is voluntary, even if subtle. Consent often includes mentally indulging the temptation. Finney taught that inward indulgence is real consent. This includes deliberately dwelling on it, replaying it voluntarily, enjoying it mentally, choosing not to resist it, even without outward action. Because the will has chosen gratification inwardly. He emphasized that sin begins in the will, not the outward act. Consent removes inward resistance. When the will is resisting temptation, there is inward opposition. Consent removes that opposition. The will stops resisting. It allows the desire, even if outward restraint remains. Outward restraint alone does not determine obedience. The will determines obedience. Consent is always voluntary, never forced. Finney insisted that no feeling can force consent. He wrote, "The will cannot be compelled by the sensibility." This means no matter how strong a feeling is, consent is still a choice. This preserves moral responsibility. Without voluntary consent, there is no sin. Consent is the adoption of self-gratification as the end, even temporarily. Finney taught that sin always involves choosing self as the supreme end. Even temporally. Consent is when the will adopts self-gratification instead of obedience to God. Even briefly. The governing intention shifts in that moment. That shift is sin. Lack of consent feels like inward refusal, even if feelings remain strong. When the will refuses consent, there is a settled inward stance like, "No, I will not choose this." Even if the feelings remain intense. Even if the temptation persists. The will remains set against it. This is obedience, not sin. The presence of desire does not equal consent. Only the will's embrace equals consent. Finney taught that consent is always recognizable by honest self-examination. Finney believed that people can know whether they have consented by examining their intention honestly. Not their feelings, but their choice. He believed the will is conscious of its own choices. Consent is not unconscious. It is a real inward decision. Finney's clearest summary definition. Consent of the will is the voluntary inward choice to embrace self-gratification as an end, rather than choosing obedience to God. Temptation presents the option. Consent chooses it. Without consent, there is no sin. Simple real-life example using Finney's framework. Temptation. You feel pride rise. Consent would be choosing to embrace the pride, enjoying the idea of self-exaltation. Refusal would be rejecting it inwardly, choosing humility. Even if the feeling lingers. The will's choice determines the moral state. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework. According to Finney, consent of the will is not a feeling but a voluntary inward decision to embrace self-gratification instead of obedience to God. Temptation consists of involuntary desires arising in the sensibility, but sin occurs only when the will willingly agrees with and adopts those desires as its end. If the will refuses consent and remains set on pleasing God, there is obedience, even if strong temptation continues. Why consent can sometimes happen very subtly, and how Finney taught believers to detect and prevent even small acts of inward consent. Section 1. Consent often begins as a quiet relaxation of resistance asterisk. Charles Finney warned that consent of the will can sometimes happen very subtly, not as a dramatic decision, but as a quiet inward shift from resistance to willingness. He taught that believers must learn to detect these subtle movements, not by analyzing feelings, but by examining the direction of the will and attention. Here is how Finney explained this, and how he taught people to detect and prevent even small acts of inward consent. Finney taught that consent does not always feel like saying, "I choose sin." Often it begins as simply stopping resistance. Instead of actively rejecting the temptation, the will becomes passive. This passivity is itself a choice. Resistance ceases. The will allows the desire to remain without opposing it. This is often the first subtle step of consent. He taught that obedience requires active refusal, not mere inactivity. Section 2. Consent often shows itself through voluntarily dwelling on the temptation. Finney emphasized that attention reveals the will's intention. If the mind voluntarily continues to dwell on the temptation, this indicates the will is no longer fully resisting. He taught that the will governs attention. So when attention remains on the temptation voluntarily, it shows inward allowance, even if the person does not outwardly act on it. This is why he emphasized redirecting attention quickly. Section 3. Consent often appears as inward sympathy with the temptation. Finney taught that when the will is fully obedient, it inwardly sides with God against the temptation. But when consent begins, the will starts sympathizing with the temptation. There is a subtle inward agreement. Not necessarily full surrender, but a movement toward willingness. This inward sympathy indicates the will is shifting its alignment. Section 4. Consent often occurs before outward action, and even before full conscious realization asterisk. Finney taught that sin always begins in the will. Outward actions simply express inward consent. This inward shift can happen quickly and quietly, sometimes before outward behavior changes. This is why he emphasized guarding the will itself, not merely outward conduct. Section 5. Consent strengthens temptation immediately. Finney taught that when the will consents, even subtly, temptation gains strength. Because consent reinforces the desire. This makes future resistance harder. But when the will refuses consent, temptation weakens. This is governed by fixed laws of mind. Section 6. The clearest sign of non-consent is active inward refusal. Finney taught that true obedience involves a definite inward stance. A real choice against the temptation. Not passive avoidance, but active rejection, even if calm and quiet. This refusal preserves obedience, regardless of feelings. Section 7. Finney taught that immediate refusal prevents consent from developing. The safest response is immediate rejection. Not debate, not analysis, not prolonged attention. Immediate refusal prevents the will from drifting toward consent. Delay increases vulnerability. Quick refusal preserves inward stability. Section 8. Consent can be prevented by maintaining a firm, settled governing intention toward God. Finney taught that when the will remains firmly established in choosing God as its supreme end, temptations lose their persuasive power. The will remains steady. This prevents inward shifting. Stability of intention is protective. Section 9. Finney emphasized honesty with oneself. He taught that self-deception occurs when people ignore or excuse subtle inward consent. Honest self-examination prevents this. Not obsessive introspection, but honest recognition of the will's true choice. The will knows whether it has embraced or rejected temptation. Section 10. Finney's clearest summary principle asterisk. Consent occurs when the will stops opposing temptation and begins allowing or embracing it, even subtly. Obedience consists in maintaining active inward refusal and choosing God as the supreme end, regardless of what feelings are present. Finney's simple analogy asterisk. Imagine holding a door shut against pressure. Resistance keeps the door closed. Consent begins the moment you stop resisting, even if you do not open it fully. The release of resistance allows movement. Maintaining resistance keeps the door closed. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework asterisk. According to Finney, consent can occur subtly when the will relaxes its resistance, allows attention to dwell on temptation, or inwardly sympathizes with it. This may happen quietly before outward action. Finney taught that consent is prevented by immediate refusal, redirecting attention, maintaining a firm governing intention toward God, and honest self-awareness. The key issue is not the presence of temptation, but whether the will actively resists or allows it. Section 11. The difference between involuntary mental replay and voluntary indulgence asterisk. Charles Finney made an important distinction between involuntary mental replay and voluntary mental indulgence. This distinction is critical, because many people mistakenly think that the mere presence of a thought, memory, or mental image is sin, even when the will is actually resisting it. Finney would say the difference lies entirely in what the will does with the mental content, not in the fact that it appeared. Here is his explanation in clear, precise terms based on his systematic theology and sermons. Involuntary mental replay originates in the intellect and sensibility, not the will. Finney taught that the mind naturally reproduces thoughts, memories, and images through the laws of association. He explained that when something has been previously experienced, the intellect and sensibility may reproduce it automatically. This is involuntary. It is not chosen. It is not initiated by the will. He wrote in substance that the sensibility and intellect operate according to fixed laws and are not directly controlled by the will. This means a thought or image can appear without any consent of the will. Its appearance is not sin. Voluntary indulgence begins when the will chooses to retain and dwell on the thought. Finney taught that the will governs attention. If the will allows the mind to dwell on the thought voluntarily, this becomes indulgence. This is the key transition point. The difference is not the appearance of the thought, but the will's response to it. Indulgence includes choosing to continue thinking about it, mentally replaying it voluntarily, enjoying it inwardly, refusing to dismiss it. This is consent, even if no outward action follows. Involuntary thoughts often feel intrusive and unwelcome. Finney would say that involuntary thoughts often feel like something happening to you, not something you are choosing. They may feel unwanted, disturbing, or contrary to your true intention. This is evidence that the will is not consenting, because the will does not identify with them. It opposes them. This is temptation, not sin. Voluntary indulgence feels like inward willingness or allowance. Finney taught that consent involves willingness. When indulgence occurs, there is an inward allowance. The will permits the thought to remain. Even quietly, the will stops opposing it. This inward allowance is consent, not the original appearance. The speed of rejection helps reveal the will's intention. Finney taught that when the will is fully set on obedience, it rejects temptation promptly, not necessarily instantly eliminating the thought, but refusing agreement. The thought may linger in the sensibility, but the will does not embrace it. If the will chooses to dwell on it, that is indulgence. If the will refuses and redirects attention, that is obedience. The will does not control what appears, but it controls what is entertained. This was one of Finney's clearest psychological principles. You cannot always control what appears in your mind, but you always control whether you entertain it. Entertainment is voluntary. Appearance is often involuntary. This is the dividing line. Emotional intensity does not determine consent. Finney taught that a thought or image may produce strong emotional reactions. This does not mean the will has consented. Emotional reaction belongs to the sensibility. Consent belongs to the will. The will may reject something even while emotions respond strongly. This is still obedience. The will reveals itself by what it chooses to focus on. Finney taught that attention is governed by the will. If the will redirects attention away from the temptation, this shows refusal. If the will sustains attention on it voluntarily, this shows indulgence. Attention reveals intention. Finney's clearest summary principle. Involuntary mental replay is not sin, because it arises without the will's consent. Sin begins only when the will voluntarily entertains, embraces, or indulges the thought. Finney's simple real-life example. A memory appears suddenly. Involuntary replay. The memory appears, you do not want it, you refuse it, you redirect attention. No sin occurred. Voluntary indulgence. The memory appears, you choose to dwell on it, you mentally replay it, you inwardly enjoy it. This is consent of the will. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework *. According to Finney, involuntary mental replay originates in the intellect and sensibility through natural laws of association and is not itself sinful. Sin occurs only when the will voluntarily entertains, embraces, or indulges the thought. The moral character of the person is determined not by what appears in the mind, but by whether the will consents to or rejects it. Section 12. Why temptation sometimes becomes more frequent temporarily, when someone first begins consistently resisting it. Charles Finney taught that temptation may sometimes become more frequent or more noticeable temporarily when a person first begins consistently resisting it, and he gave several clear reasons rooted in his understanding of the sensibility, habit, attention, and moral agency. Importantly, he did not see this as evidence of failure, but often as evidence that the will has truly changed. Here is his explanation based on his systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and related sermons. Because resistance exposes desires that were previously indulged automatically. Before the will is fully set against sin, indulgence may occur almost automatically, without much internal conflict. Once the will begins firmly resisting, those same desires are no longer being gratified. Now they are felt as opposition. Finney taught that resistance makes temptation more noticeable, not necessarily stronger, but more consciously perceived. Previously there was little resistance. Now there is conscious refusal. This makes the conflict more visible. Because habits that were reinforced in the past continue producing momentum. Finney believed the sensibility follows laws of habit and association. When a desire has been repeatedly indulged in the past, the sensibility has been conditioned to produce it more readily. When the will stops consenting, the habit does not instantly disappear. It continues producing impulses for a time. Not because the will still agrees, but because the sensibility is still operating according to previous conditioning. This momentum gradually weakens as indulgence stops. Because withdrawing indulgence initially causes the sensibility to react more actively. Finney understood that when indulgence is withdrawn, the sensibility may temporarily react more strongly. This is not because the will is failing. It is because the emotional system was accustomed to gratification. When gratification stops, the system continues producing impulses out of habit. Over time, without reinforcement, these impulses weaken. This is part of the realignment process. Because attention becomes more spiritually alert. When a person becomes serious about obedience, their awareness increases. They notice things they previously ignored. Finney taught that spiritual awakening increases moral awareness. Temptations that were once unnoticed or tolerated become more visible. This is not new sin. It is new clarity. The will is now aligned with truth. So it recognizes temptation more clearly. Because temptation presents alternatives necessary for moral freedom. Finney believed moral agency requires real alternatives. Temptation presents those alternatives. As the will strengthens in obedience, temptation may present itself repeatedly. not because obedience is weak, but because moral agency involves continual opportunity for choice. Each refusal strengthens the governing intention. Because weakening old desires is a gradual process governed by fixed laws. Finney taught that the sensibility gradually conforms to the will through habit and attention. He wrote in substance that feelings come to correspond with the governing intention of the will. This process takes time, not because the will is incomplete, but because emotional patterns adjust progressively. Consistent refusal leads to gradual weakening, because resistance itself is strengthening the will's governing intention. Finney believed that each act of refusal strengthens obedience. Resistance reinforces the will's commitment to God. This makes obedience more stable, even if temptation still appears temporarily. Resistance builds inward stability, not weakness. Finney warned that increased temptation does not mean increased sin. He emphasized that temptation itself is not sin. Only consent is sin. A person may experience frequent temptation while remaining fully obedient. The presence of temptation does not define the moral state. The will's choice defines the moral state. Finney taught that consistent refusal inevitably weakens temptation. He taught that temptation weakens through disuse. When the will consistently refuses indulgence, the emotional reinforcement stops. Without reinforcement, desire loses strength. This is governed by fixed psychological and spiritual laws. It is gradual but reliable. Finney's clearest summary principle. Temptation may temporarily appear more frequently when indulgence stops, because the sensibility continues operating according to previous habits and conditioning. However, as the will consistently refuses consent and maintains its governing intention toward God, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony, and temptation loses its power. Finney's simple analogy asterisk. If a wheel has been spinning for a long time, it continues spinning after power is removed. Not because new force is being applied, but because of existing momentum. Eventually it slows and stops. The same principle applies to temptation. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework asterisk. According to Finney, temptation may temporarily become more noticeable or frequent when a person begins consistently resisting it, because the sensibility continues operating according to past conditioning and habit. This does not indicate failure, but reflects the gradual realignment of the emotional nature with the governing intention of the will. As the will remains firm in obedience and refuses consent, temptation weakens progressively through fixed laws of mind and habit. Section 13. Why peace and stability increase once the will becomes fully settled in its supreme intention toward God. Charles Finney taught that deep peace and inward stability naturally increase when the will becomes fully settled in choosing God as its supreme end, because the root cause of inner conflict, competition between God and self as the governing intention, is removed. His explanation is very systematic and grounded in his view that the will is the controlling faculty of moral character. Here is Finney's explanation, drawn from systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and his revival sermons. Peace comes when the will stops vacillating between two supreme ends. Finney taught that inner instability exists when the will is divided between choosing God as the supreme end and choosing self-gratification as the supreme end. This creates internal inconsistency. He wrote in substance that a divided will produces inward unrest, because the mind is not unified. But when the will becomes fully settled in choosing God, this division ends. The inner life becomes unified, and peace naturally follows. Peace results from harmony between conscience and the will. Finney taught that conscience affirms obedience and opposes selfishness. When the will chooses selfishness, conscience produces inward disturbance. When the will chooses God, conscience affirms the choice. This removes inward contradiction. The mind experiences harmony. This harmony produces peace, not as a separate act, but as a natural result. Stability increases because the governing intention becomes consistent. Finney emphasized that instability comes from inconsistent intention. When the will repeatedly shifts between obedience and self-gratification, the person experiences instability. But when the will becomes firmly established in one governing intention, choosing God, this instability disappears. The will becomes steady. This steadiness produces inward stability. Emotional conflict gradually decreases as the sensibility aligns with the will. Finney taught that once the will becomes settled, the sensibility gradually conforms to it. He wrote, "The feelings come to correspond with the state of the will. This does not happen instantly, but progressively. As the sensibility aligns with the will, emotional conflict decreases. Peace increases. Uncertainty disappears when the supreme intention becomes clear and settled." Finney taught that uncertainty about one's true intention produces anxiety. When the will is fully consecrated, there is clarity. The person knows their governing intention. This removes internal doubt and instability. Certainty produces peace. Internal resistance weakens because the will is no longer resisting truth. Finney believed that resistance to truth produces inward tension. When the will fully yields to truth, resistance stops. The mind no longer struggles against its own moral obligations. This removes internal friction. Peace follows naturally. Stability increases because the will is the governing faculty of the mind. Finney taught that the will directs the overall course of the mind. When the will is unstable, the mind is unstable. When the will is stable, the mind becomes stable. Because the governing faculty is settled, this brings order to the whole inner life. Peace increases because obedience eliminates the cause of moral conflict. Finney taught that moral conflict exists when the will is choosing against what the intellect and conscience recognize as right. When the will aligns with truth, this conflict disappears. There is no longer internal contradiction. This produces inward rest. Finney emphasized that peace comes from settled intention, not from absence of temptation. He did not teach that peace requires the total absence of temptation. He taught that peace comes from the will being settled. Temptations may still arise in the sensibility, but they no longer produce instability. Because the will is firmly established, the governing intention remains unchanged. Finney's clearest summary principle: peace and stability result when the will becomes fully and consistently established in choosing God as the supreme end, bringing harmony to the conscience, intellect, and sensibility, and removing the internal conflict caused by divided intention. Finney's simple analogy: a compass needle settles when it is aligned with true north. If it keeps shifting, it is unstable. When it settles firmly, it becomes steady. The will settling on God produces the same inward stability. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework **. According to Finney, peace and stability increase when the will becomes fully settled in choosing God as the supreme end, because this removes the internal conflict caused by divided intention. The conscience, intellect, and sensibility gradually come into harmony with the governing choice of the will, producing inward unity, certainty, and rest. This peace results from moral alignment, not from the absence of temptation, but from the firmness of the will's consecration. How to know when the will has truly become settled versus when it is still vacillating, continued. Section 1. The settled will is marked by a present, unconditional choice, not a past decision or future hope *. Finney stressed that a truly settled will is not something you remember deciding once long ago, nor is it a vague hope for the future. It is a definite, conscious, present reality. He taught that the governing intention must be active right now. You can test this by asking yourself honestly in this moment: is God my supreme end at this instant, or is there still a part of me holding back for self? A settled will answers with clear inward affirmation. A vacillating will hesitates, qualifies, or feels conditional: yes, but. The difference is not in emotion, it is in the honest direction of choice right now. Section 2. The settled will maintains consistency across time and circumstances, asterisk asterisk. Finney explained that vacillation shows itself over days, weeks, or months through inconsistency. A settled will does not swing back and forth in its supreme preference. Look back over recent weeks. Do you see a steady pattern of choosing God's will even in small matters? Or do you see repeated returns to self-preference when pressure comes? Consistency over time reveals a settled governing intention. Repeated shifting reveals a will that has not yet become firmly fixed. Section 3. The settled will produces a growing sense of inward unity and singleness of heart. Finney taught that when the will is divided, the person experiences inner division, tension between two competing supreme ends. When the will becomes settled on God, this inner division gradually disappears. You begin to sense a growing singleness of heart. Not emotional perfection, but moral unity. The mind is no longer pulled in two directions at its deepest level. A vacillating will continues to feel this inner tug-of-war, even if it is subtle. The settled will increasingly experiences, one thing I do, Philippians 3:13, a unified direction. Section 4. The settled will is evidenced by freedom from chronic self-condemnation over motives asterisk asterisk. Finney warned that a vacillating will often lives in chronic self-doubt and self-accusation about motives. The person is never quite sure where their heart really stands. A settled will brings freedom from this constant questioning of intention. You know your supreme choice, even when temptation or emotion is strong. You do not live in perpetual uncertainty about whether you are truly God's. This is not pride, it is the peace that comes from a clear governing intention. Section 5. The settled will shows itself in spontaneous, habitual obedience in small things. Finney taught that a truly settled will does not need constant heroic effort to obey in everyday matters. Obedience becomes more spontaneous and habitual. Small duties are fulfilled without inward debate. The settled will has trained the life around its supreme choice. A vacillating will still debate small matters or frequently yields in little things. The pattern of small, consistent obedience reveals a settled heart. Section 6. The settled will is not afraid of honest self-examination asterisk. Finney repeatedly said that the truly consecrated person welcomes light. They are willing to examine their motives without terror. A settled will can look inward calmly and say, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." Psalm 139:23. They know the governing intention is Godward. A vacillating will fears deep examination because it suspects, or knows, the intention is still divided. Avoidance of honest self-searching is a sign of vacillation. Section 7. The settled will experiences increasing joy in God's will, even in trial asterisk. Finney taught that when the will is settled on God, joy and obedience grows, even amid difficulty. The person finds increasing delight in doing God's will for its own sake. This joy is not constant emotional high, but a deep satisfaction in alignment with God. A vacillating will finds obedience burdensome or joyless because it is still partly resisted. Growing joy in God's will is evidence of a settled supreme intention. Section 8. The settled will does not need constant reconversion or rededication asterisk. Finney observed that those with a vacillating will often feel the need for repeated rededications or emotional renewals. They lose assurance quickly and must get right again and again. A settled will does not live in this cycle. The governing intention remains steady. Renewal is not constantly needed because the choice has been made and maintained. Section 9. Finney's practical self-test for settled intention. Finney would often lead people through a simple, searching question. In this present moment, if you could have your own way without any consequences, would you still choose God's will above your own? A settled will answers yes without reservation. A vacillating will hesitates, qualifies, or inwardly answers no. This test cuts through emotion to the will itself. Section 10. Finney's clearest summary principle asterisk. The will is settled when it has made God its supreme, unconditional present end, and this choice shows itself in consistent resistance to sin, universal obedience, inward unity, freedom from secret reservation, and growing joy in God's will, regardless of emotional conditions. Vacillation is revealed by shifting allegiance, secret reservations, selective obedience, chronic inward debate, and dependence on emotional reinforcement. Finney's simple practical test, repeated for emphasis. Right now, honestly, voluntarily, without regard to feeling, do you choose God as your supreme end above all self-gratification? If the answer is a clear, present yes, your will is settled. If it is conditional, hesitant, or qualified, your will is still vacillating. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework ***. According to Finney, the will is truly settled when it maintains a definite, present, unconditional choice of God as supreme end, demonstrated through consistent resistance to temptation, universal obedience, inward unity and honesty, freedom from secret reservations, and growing delight in God's will, independent of emotional state. A vacillating will continues to shift between God and self, revealed by inconsistency, selective obedience, secret reservations, chronic self-doubt, and dependence on feelings. The governing intention of the will, not passing emotions or temptation, determines whether the heart is truly settled. Keep examining your intention honestly before God. He gives light to those who truly seek it. If your will is settled on Him, rest in that choice. Peace and stability will follow as your whole being comes into harmony with it. How Finney would counsel someone specifically with intrusive fearful thoughts that keep returning repeatedly. Section 1, First Assurance, the thoughts themselves are not sin ***. Charles Finney would counsel someone experiencing intrusive fearful thoughts that keep returning by carefully distinguishing between involuntary thoughts, arising in the sensibility and intellect and voluntary consent of the will, and then teaching them how to govern the will and attention so those thoughts gradually lose power. His counsel would be very practical, calm, and freeing, not condemning. Here is how he would guide someone step by step, based on his systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and pastoral sermons. This would be his first and most important step. Finney taught that thoughts can arise involuntarily through association, memory, nervous system reactions, past conditioning, external stimuli. These are not acts of the will. They are events in the sensibility and intellect. He taught clearly that moral character belongs to the will, not involuntary mental events. So he would say, the thought appearing is not sin. Only consenting to it is sin. If the will rejects it, there is obedience, not guilt. Section 2, Warning against forceful suppression. It often makes thoughts return more. Finney taught that emotional and mental states are strengthened by attention. If a person tries to forcefully suppress the thought, they keep attention fixed on it. This strengthens the mental loop. He would counsel against obsessively fighting the thought itself. Not because resistance is wrong, but because fixation strengthens it. The goal is to govern attention calmly, not panic. Section 3, Calm refusal of consent, at the level of the will ***. Finney would teach a simple inward act of the will. A calm refusal. Not emotional struggle. Not panic. But a settled inward stance. I do not choose this. This preserves obedience completely. Even if the thought lingers, the will remains aligned with truth. This is the decisive point. Section 4, Redirect attention toward truth and present duty. Finney emphasized that attention reshapes emotional and mental patterns. He would instruct the person to focus on present responsibilities, focus on truth, focus on obedience, focus on God, instead of continuing to analyze the intrusive thought. Redirection weakens the thought's power. Over time, the mental association weakens. Section 5, Repeated refusal gradually weakens the thoughts ***. Finney believed the sensibility follows laws of habit and reinforcement. Thoughts that are indulged strengthen. Thoughts that are consistently refused weaken, even if they return temporarily. Without reinforcement, they lose strength. This process is gradual but reliable. Section 6. Warning against interpreting repetition as evidence of a divided heart asterisk. Finney taught that temptation and unwanted thoughts do not define the heart. The will's governing intention defines the heart. If the will consistently refuses the thought, the heart remains obedient, even if the thought appears repeatedly. The repetition does not indicate consent. Only the will's choice does. Section 7. Settle the will firmly in trusting God asterisk. Finney taught that stability comes from a settled governing intention. The person should firmly choose. I belong to God, I choose truth. This stabilizes the will. This reduces internal conflict. Peace gradually increases. Section 8. Discourage excessive self-examination focused on the thoughts asterisk. Finney warned that excessive inward examination strengthens instability. He would advise focusing outward. Obedience, truth, duty, God, instead of repeatedly analyzing the thoughts. This reduces reinforcement. Section 9. Intrusive thoughts often lose strength when no longer feared. Fear itself reinforces the mental loop. When the person calmly refuses consent and does not panic, the thought loses its emotional charge. Without emotional reinforcement, it weakens. This follows natural psychological laws. Section 10. Finney's core pastoral counsel in one sentence. He would say, intrusive fearful thoughts are not sin unless your will consents to them. Calmly refuse them, do not dwell on them, fix your attention on truth and present duty, and as your will remains settled in God, these thoughts will gradually lose their power. What Finney would likely say in simple pastoral language. He might say something like, these thoughts do not define your character. They arise in your sensibility, not in your will. If your will refuses them and remains set on trusting God, you are obedient. Do not be disturbed by their presence. Turn your attention to your duty and to God. As you refuse consent, these thoughts will weaken and lose their influence. Section 11. The difference between intrusive thoughts and actual unbelief asterisk. Charles Finney made a very clear distinction between intrusive thoughts of fear or doubt and actual unbelief. This distinction rests entirely on his central principle. Unbelief is an act of the will, not the mere presence of a thought or feeling. Here is how Finney would explain the difference, based on his systematic theology, lectures on faith, and pastoral sermons. Intrusive thoughts arise involuntarily. Unbelief is a voluntary choice. Finney taught that intrusive thoughts originate in the intellect and sensibility through natural laws of association. They are not chosen. They appear automatically. Unbelief, however, is when the will deliberately refuses to trust God. He defined unbelief in substance as the will's refusal to confide in God and His truth. This is a voluntary posture, not a mental event that happens involuntarily. So the thought appearing is not unbelief. Only choosing to embrace it is unbelief. Intrusive thoughts feel unwelcome. Unbelief feels like inward agreement. Finney would point out this key difference. Intrusive thought feels unwanted, feels foreign to your true intention, produces inward resistance. Unbelief involves inward agreement, involves willingness to distrust, involves adopting distrust as your position. The will's agreement is the defining factor, not the thought's presence. Intrusive thoughts do not change the governing intention, unbelief does. Finney taught that the heart is defined by the supreme intention of the will. Intrusive thoughts do not change that intention. They are disturbances in the sensibility. Unbelief changes the will's governing position. It is a shift in allegiance. If the will remains set on trusting God, unbelief has not occurred. Even if intrusive doubts appear, intrusive thoughts may continue while genuine faith remains fully intact. Finney taught that faith is not the absence of contrary thoughts. Faith is the will's settled trust in God. A person may experience thoughts of doubt while continuing to choose trust. the will remains aligned with faith's. This is real faith. The thoughts do not cancel it. Unbelief occurs when the will adopts distrust as its position. Finney defined sin, including unbelief, as choosing self over God. In the case of unbelief, the will adopts distrust. Not merely feeling uncertainty, but choosing to rely on something other than God. This is consent of the will, not involuntary mental disturbance. Intrusive thoughts often test and strengthen faith when resisted. Finney believed temptation tests the will's governing intention. When intrusive doubts appear and the will refuses them, faith is strengthened. The will reaffirms its trust in God. This reinforces obedience. The presence of temptation does not weaken faith unless the will consents. Emotional disturbance does not equal unbelief. Finney taught that emotional fear and intellectual doubt can arise involuntarily. These belong to the sensibility and intellect, not the will. Unbelief occurs only when the will embraces distrust, not when emotional or mental disturbance appears. The will remains fully capable of trusting God regardless of intrusive thoughts. Finney emphasized that the will is free. Intrusive thoughts cannot force unbelief. The will retains full power to trust God, regardless of mental or emotional disturbance. This preserves moral responsibility and freedom. Finney's clearest diagnostic question. He would ask, do you choose to trust God? Or do you choose to distrust Him? Not to. Do you feel doubt? Not to. Do thoughts of doubt appear? But to. What does your will choose? If the will chooses trust, faith is present, regardless of intrusive thoughts. Finney's clearest summary principle. Intrusive thoughts of doubt are involuntary mental events and do not constitute unbelief. Unbelief exists only when the will voluntarily adopts distrust and refuses to confide in God. Finney's simple example. Intrusive doubt. The thought appears, what if God doesn't help me? You respond inwardly, no, I trust God. This is faith, not unbelief. Unbelief would be, the thought appears, and the will embraces it, I do not trust God. That is unbelief. The difference is the will's consent. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework *. According to Finney, intrusive thoughts of doubt or fear are involuntary disturbances in the intellect and sensibility, and do not constitute unbelief. Unbelief occurs only when the will voluntarily refuses to trust God and adopts distrust as its governing intention. If the will continues to choose trust in God, faith remains intact regardless of intrusive thoughts or emotional disturbance. Section 12. Why sensitive and sincere believers often experience more intrusive thoughts than careless ones *. Charles Finney directly addressed why sincere, sensitive, and conscientious believers often experience more intrusive thoughts, fears, or disturbing mental impressions than careless or indifferent people. His explanation is rooted in his understanding of the sensibility, attention, conscience, and the governing intention of the will. He did not interpret this as spiritual failure, but often as the opposite. Here are the main reasons Finney gave. Because a tender conscience becomes more alert to what careless people ignore. Finney taught that when the will becomes fully set on obeying God, the conscience becomes more sensitive and active. He explained that careless people may have the same thoughts, but do not notice or care. A sincere believer notices them immediately because their will is set against sin. He wrote in substance that when the conscience is awake and active, it detects even subtle movements of the sensibility. This increased awareness makes intrusive thoughts more noticeable. Not more sinful, just more visible. Because resistance exposes thoughts that were previously indulged automatically. Before the will is fully consecrated, certain thoughts may occur and be indulged without much resistance. After consecration, the will opposes them. This creates conscious conflict. The thoughts are now noticed because they are being resisted. Previously, they passed unnoticed because they were not opposed. Resistance reveals them, not causes them, because attention becomes more disciplined and morally focused. Finney taught that when a person becomes serious about obedience, their attention becomes more focused on moral and spiritual truth. This increased focus makes mental disturbances more apparent. The person is no longer mentally drifting. They are morally alert. This alertness detects disturbances that were previously ignored. Because the sensibility still operates according to past associations and conditioning. Finney taught that the sensibility follows fixed laws of association. Past experiences may continue producing mental impressions for a time, even when the will has fully turned to God. Sensitive believers are more aware of these impressions because their will opposes them. This awareness reflects moral clarity, not moral failure, because Satan targets those whose will is firmly set on obedience. Finney believed that temptation is most meaningful when directed at those committed to obedience. He taught that temptation presents alternatives for the will to reject. Those firmly committed to God may experience strong temptations, not because they are weak, but because their obedience is being tested and strengthened. The will's refusal reinforces stability, because sincere believers often mistakenly interpret temptation as sin. Finney taught that many sincere believers misunderstand the distinction between sensibility and will. They assume that unwanted thoughts equal consent. This misunderstanding produces unnecessary fear and anxiety. Careless people do not experience this distress because they are not concerned with obedience. Sensitive believers care deeply, so they examine themselves more carefully, because the will's firm opposition makes the conflict more noticeable. When the will fully opposes sin, any contrary impulse becomes immediately apparent. This creates a noticeable contrast. The conflict is not evidence of divided intention. It is evidence of moral clarity. The will and sensibility are temporarily out of harmony, but the will remains governing, because moral sensitivity increases as spiritual maturity increases. Finney taught that growth in holiness increases moral sensitivity. The person becomes more aware of subtle internal movements. This sensitivity reflects increased alignment with truth, not increased sinfulness. Awareness increases, not guilt, because intrusive thoughts lose power when consistently refused. Finney emphasized that repeated refusal weakens intrusive thoughts. Sensitive believers who consistently refuse consent gradually experience greater emotional stability. The sensibility aligns with the will over time. This process strengthens inward peace. Finney's clearest summary principle. Finney taught in substance that sincere believers often experience greater awareness of intrusive thoughts because their conscience is more sensitive and their will is firmly opposed to sin. These thoughts arise in the sensibility involuntarily and do not indicate sin unless the will consents to them. Increased awareness reflects spiritual sensitivity, not spiritual failure. What Finney would likely say pastorally, in simple terms, ***. He might say something like, "The fact that these thoughts trouble you is evidence that your will is set against them. A careless person would not be disturbed. Your opposition to them proves that your heart is loyal. Do not mistake temptation for sin. Stand firm in your will, refuse consent, and these disturbances will gradually lose their power." Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework ***. According to Finney, sincere and sensitive believers often experience more intrusive thoughts because their awakened conscience and firm opposition to sin make them more aware of involuntary mental disturbances that careless people ignore. These thoughts arise automatically in the sensibility and intellect through natural laws of association and past conditioning. They do not constitute sin unless the will consents to them. The increased awareness reflects spiritual sensitivity and moral clarity, not spiritual failure or divided intention. Consistent refusal of consent gradually weakens the thoughts as the sensibility aligns with the settled governing intention of the will. Finney explained the exact moment when temptation turns into sin, in precise psychological terms, continued. Section 1. Recap of the foundational principle. Sin is never involuntary. Charles Finney was extremely precise about the exact moment temptation becomes sin, and he located that moment entirely in the will's voluntary consent, not in the feeling, not in the thought, and not in the initial desire. He taught that temptation becomes sin at the precise instant the will embraces self-gratification as an end, instead of continuing to reject it. Here is his explanation step by step in clear psychological terms, faithful to his systematic theology and sermons. Temptation begins when the intellect perceives something, and the sensibility produces desire. This is the first stage. The mind perceives something. The sensibility produces a corresponding emotional response automatically. This may include fear, pride, lust, anxiety, selfish impulse. This stage is involuntary. Finney taught this stage has no moral character. It is not sin. It is simply temptation. Section 2. The critical moment of moral agency, the will's awareness and choice *. The will becomes aware of the desire and must choose how to respond. This is the critical moment of moral agency. The will now faces two possible directions: reject the desire, or embrace the desire. This choice determines whether sin occurs. The desire itself does not determine sin. The will's choice determines sin. Section 3. The precise instant sin begins, the will's consent. Sin begins at the precise instant the will consents to the desire. Finney defined sin as the will's choice of self-gratification as the supreme end. This consent may be quiet, internal, subtle. It does not require outward action. It may occur entirely within the will. The moment the will inwardly says, yes, sin exists. Before that moment there is no sin. Only temptation. Section 4. Consent is an act of inward agreement, not a feeling. Consent is not a feeling, it is an act of inward agreement. Consent does not feel like the desire itself. It feels like willingness. A shift from resistance to allowance. The will stops opposing the desire and adopts it. Even briefly. That shift is the precise moment sin begins. Not the emotional pull, but the will's agreement. Section 5. No sin as long as refusal continues, regardless of intensity. As long as the will continues to refuse the desire, no sin occurs. Even if the desire remains strong. The thought repeats. Emotional pressure continues. If the will continues to refuse consent, obedience remains complete. Finney emphasized this strongly. Temptation without consent is not sin, no matter how intense. Section 6. The will can refuse while the sensibility keeps producing desire. Finney taught that the sensibility and will can temporarily conflict. The sensibility produces desire. The will rejects it. This is temptation, not sin. Sin requires the will to change sides. As long as the will remains opposed, there is no sin. Section 7. The transition occurs entirely within the will ***. The transition from temptation to sin occurs entirely within the will. Not in the body. Not in the emotions. Not in the intellect. Only in the will. The will determines moral character. Not the intensity of desire. Not the presence of intrusive thoughts. Only consent. Section 8. Consent is always voluntary, never forced. Finney insisted that the will is free. No desire can force consent. No emotion can force consent. Consent is always chosen. This preserves moral responsibility. Without voluntary consent, sin cannot exist. Section 9. Sin can exist without outward action, if inward consent occurs. Finney taught that outward behavior is not the defining moment. The defining moment is inward intention. Outward action expresses the will. But sin begins before outward action. At consent. Section 10, Finney's clearest summary definition, asterisk. Temptation becomes sin at the exact moment the will voluntarily consents to self-gratification, instead of continuing to choose obedience to God. Before consent, temptation only. After consent, sin exists. Finney's simple timeline illustration. Stage 1, thought or desire appears. Not sin. Stage 2, emotional pull is felt. Not sin. Stage 3, will rejects the desire. Obedience. Stage 4, will embraces the desire. Sin begins here. The precise moment is the will's inward embrace. Finney's simplest one-sentence explanation. Sin does not consist in feeling temptation, but in the will's consenting to it. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework, asterisk. According to Finney, temptation becomes sin at the precise moment the will voluntarily consents to self-gratification as its end. The appearance of desire, emotional pull, or intrusive thoughts does not constitute sin. Only the will's inward agreement transforms temptation into sin. As long as the will continues to refuse consent, the person remains fully obedient regardless of the strength or persistence of temptation. Section 11, distinction between momentary mental attention and actual consent. Charles Finney made a very important and precise distinction between momentary mental attention and actual consent of the will, because many people mistakenly assume that merely noticing or momentarily focusing on a thought means they have sinned. Finney taught that this is not true. The key issue is not whether attention briefly occurs, but whether the will adopts the thought as its end. Here is his explanation clearly and carefully. Momentary attention can occur involuntarily and is not itself sin. Finney taught that when a thought, image, or feeling appears, the mind naturally becomes aware of it. This initial awareness often includes momentary attention. This happens automatically. It is part of how the intellect functions. The will did not create the thought. The will did not invite it. The will simply became aware of it. This awareness has no moral character by itself. It is not consent. It is perception. The will must decide whether to retain or dismiss the thought. Once the thought becomes present, the will has a choice. Dismiss it, or retain and entertain it. This choice determines whether sin occurs. The thought's presence does not determine sin. The will's response determines sin. Finney emphasized that the will governs whether attention continues voluntarily. Consent begins when the will chooses to entertain or embrace the thought. Finney taught that consent occurs when the will chooses to dwell on the thought, allows it to remain voluntarily, embraces its gratification, inwardly adopts it. This is more than momentary attention. It is voluntary indulgence. It is inward agreement. This is the moment sin begins. Momentary attention while resisting is not consent. Finney was very clear about this. A person may briefly notice or even momentarily attend to a thought while the will is still opposing it. This is not sin, because the will has not embraced it. The will remains set against it. The attention is part of awareness, not indulgence. What matters is whether the will chooses to retain or reject it. Consent involves willingness, involuntary attention does not. This is one of Finney's most important distinctions. Consent includes inward willingness. Momentary attention does not. Consent says in substance, I will allow this. Resistance says, I refuse this. Even if the thought lingers briefly. The will's stance determines obedience. The will reveals its intention by what it chooses to dwell on voluntarily. Finney taught that the will governs sustained attention. If attention continues because the will chooses it, this is indulgence. If attention is redirected because the will refuses it, this is obedience. The key distinction is voluntary continuation, not initial awareness. Emotional reaction during momentary attention does not equal consent. Finney taught that emotional responses may occur automatically when a thought appears. This belongs to the sensibility, not the will. Even if emotional reactions occur, there is no sin unless the will embraces them. The will may still reject the thought fully. Emotional response alone is not consent. The will remains obedient as long as it refuses inward agreement. Finney emphasized that obedience consists in the will's governing intention. As long as the will refuses to adopt the thought as its end, obedience remains complete. Even if attention briefly occurred, even if emotional reaction occurred, consent alone determines sin. Finney's clearest summary principle: momentary mental attention to a thought is not sin. Sin occurs only when the will voluntarily consents to and embraces the thought as its end. Finney's simple example: a fearful thought appears. You notice it. For a moment, your mind focuses on it. But inwardly, you reject it. You redirect your attention. This is not sin. Your will never consented. Consent would be choosing to dwell on it, embracing it inwardly, allowing it voluntarily. That is the difference. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework **. According to Finney, momentary mental attention is part of involuntary mental awareness and does not constitute sin. Sin occurs only when the will voluntarily chooses to retain, entertain, or embrace the thought. The moral character of the person is determined by the will's consent, not by involuntary attention or emotional response.